December 25, 1989. A shuttered military garrison in Târgoviște, 50 miles northwest of Bucharest. A folding table sits in a room that still smells like a mess hall, because 2 hours ago, it was one. Behind the table, 3 uniformed judges, nobody in Romania has ever heard of, appointed less than 24 hours earlier. In front of it, in 2 plastic chairs, sit Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, the man and woman who have ruled Romania for 24 years, who have never once in that time answered to anyone. Nicolae wears the same gray overcoat he wore 3 days ago on a palace balcony, when 100,000 people stopped clapping for him in the middle of a live broadcast. Elena's hands are tied behind her back with rope, and it clearly humiliates her more than it restrains her. A video camera runs. Whoever is holding it is shaking. The chief judge reads the first charge: genocide. 60,000 deaths, he claims, though the number is almost certainly wrong. Nicolae doesn't blink. He leans toward the microphone and says something that will outlive him by decades. I do not recognize this court. He says it like a man who still believes, on some level, that saying it will make it true. It won't. In 90 minutes, this 2-man tribunal in a borrowed schoolroom will decide the fate of one of the last untouched dictators of the Cold War. And in Romania's telling, it isn't a trial at all. It's an execution with a script. Here's what should unsettle you about that. This trial broke almost every rule of due process a Western viewer would recognize. No real defense, no appeal, a verdict apparently decided before the hearing began, and Romanians still, to this day, largely consider it justice. Not a miscarriage of it. The real story isn't whether the Ceaușescus deserved a trial, it's how a regime that took 24 years to build could collapse in 8 days, and how the last communist government in Europe to fall violently became the only one that did. To understand why that courtroom in Târgoviște looked the way it did, improvised, furious, almost vengeful, you have to go back to a village called Scornicești, in Olt County, where Nicolae Ceaușescu was born in 1918, the third of 10 children in a family that had almost nothing. He left school at 11. By 15 he was in Bucharest, apprenticed to a shoemaker, and it was there that he found the thing that would define the rest of his life, the Romanian Communist Party, at the time a small, illegal, and frequently imprisoned organization. Ceaușescu was arrested repeatedly through the 1930s and 40s for underground political activity, and prison is where he actually built his career, not through ideas, but through loyalty. He attached himself to an older party leader, ran errands, stayed quiet, stayed useful. When the communists took power in Romania after World War II, with Soviet backing, the men who had done time together in prison moved into government together. Ceaușescu climbed for 2 decades inside that structure, and in 1965, at just 47, he became the country's leader. For the first several years, the West genuinely liked him. That's the part modern audiences forget. Ceaușescu publicly split from Moscow, refused to send troops to help crush the Prague Spring in 1968, kept diplomatic relations with Israel when the rest of the Eastern Bloc cut them off, and hosted Richard Nixon and later Queen Elizabeth II. He got invited to Buckingham Palace. He got a state visit to the United States. For a communist dictator, he had remarkable PR, but the version of Ceaușescu that history remembers wasn't built by 1968. It was built by the woman standing tied up next to him in that courtroom. Elena Petrescu had a 4th-grade education and a chemistry lab technician's job when she married Nicolae in 1946. By the 1970s, she held a doctorate she almost certainly didn't earn honestly, ran the National Council for Science and Technology, sat on the Communist Party's Politburo, and was formally styled the country's first deputy prime minister, making her, on paper, the second most powerful person in Romania. Party propaganda called the two of them jointly the most beloved son and daughter of the Romanian people. Behind that title was something closer to a monarchy than a communist government, and monarchies, once you strip away the ceremony, tend to run on fear. That fear had an institution. It was called the Securitate, and by the late 1980s, it may have been the most saturated internal surveillance apparatus in the entire Eastern Bloc. Estimates vary, but some historians have argued that at its peak, the Securitate had roughly one informant for every 43 Romanians, recruited from every apartment block, every factory floor, every university department. Telephones were tapped as a matter of routine. Typewriters had to be registered with police, along with a sample of their typeface, specifically so that anonymous dissident writing could be traced back to the machine that produced it. Citizens were required to report any contact with foreigners within 24 hours. Simply owning a Western radio and being caught listening to it could end a career. And this surveillance state existed alongside a program most Romanians remember with even more bitterness: systematization. Beginning in the early 1970s and accelerating through the 80s, Ceaușescu ordered the demolition of thousands of villages. Some estimates run as high as 7,000 to 8,000 targeted, though not all were destroyed before the regime fell. To consolidate rural Romanians into concrete apartment blocks, the state considered more modern and easier to control. In Bucharest itself, an entire historic district, including churches and a hospital, was leveled to build the House of the People, a palace so enormous it remains, by some measures, the heaviest building on earth. It was under construction, unfinished, while ordinary Romanians stood in line for hours for bread, meat, and heating gas that frequently never arrived. That's the contradiction that made the winter of 1989 combustible. Ceaușescu had spent the decade paying off Romania's foreign debt, reportedly around $11 billion, almost entirely through brutal austerity, exporting food and energy the country produced while rationing it at home. State television ran, by some accounts, as little as 2 hours of programming a night, most of it devoted to Ceaușescu's speeches. He had built a country that worshipped him on camera and resented him everywhere else. By December 1989, that resentment had a fuse. It just needed a spark. The spark was a pastor named Laszlo Tokes, in the western city of Timișoara. Mircea Albu was 22 years old in December 1989, working a lathe at a Timișoara machinery plant. And, like most young workers in that city, he'd never so much as raised his voice at a party meeting. He wasn't political. He was tired, like everyone was tired, of the cold apartment and the rationed food and the sense that the entire country was performing a happiness nobody actually felt. On December 15th, he heard that police were trying to evict a Hungarian Reformed pastor, Tokes, who'd been publicly criticizing the regime's treatment of Romania's ethnic Hungarian minority. A small crowd gathered outside the pastor's church to stop it. Mircea walked past on his way home from a shift. He stopped to watch. He never made it home that night. By December 16th, the crowd outside that church had grown into something else entirely, a full demonstration moving toward the city center, chanting against Ceaușescu himself, not just the pastor's eviction. Mircea found himself swept into it, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, shouting things he'd never said out loud in his life. On December 17th, Ceaușescu, reportedly furious, reportedly convinced this was a foreign orchestrated provocation, authorized the army and Securitate to open fire on the crowds. Romanian and later international accounts put the Timișoara death toll at roughly 100 people, though in the chaos of the following days, wildly inflated rumors of thousands of dead spread across the country and out to Western media, numbers that were never true, but that Romanians believed at the time, and that mattered enormously for what happened next. Mircea got separated from his group during the shooting on the 17th. He spent that night hiding in a stairwell 3 blocks from the square, listening to gunfire he couldn't see, certain he was going to die in that building. He didn't know it yet, but the massacre he'd just survived was about to travel, first by rumor, then by radio, then straight to Bucharest, where in 4 days it would put Nicolae Ceaușescu on a balcony in front of 100,000 people, for what he still believed would be a routine show of loyalty. He was wrong about that. And what happened on that balcony is where this story's ending truly begins. December 21st, 1989. Ceaușescu, badly misjudging the mood of a country that had just watched Timișoara burn, organized a mass rally outside Communist Party headquarters in Bucharest. The same kind of staged event he'd held dozens of times before, complete with bussed-in workers and pre-printed signs. It was supposed to be a public condemnation of the hooligans in Timisoara and a demonstration of the nation's loyalty to him. State television carried it live, as it always did. For the first few minutes, it went as scripted. Then it didn't. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, people began booing. Then chanting, not for Ceaușescu, but against him, and specifically referencing Timișoara. Firecrackers, or possibly gunfire in the distance, caused a ripple of panic. And on live national television, viewers across Romania watched something that had literally never happened before. Nicolae Ceaușescu, mid-sentence, froze. His face changed. For roughly 30 seconds, an aging dictator stood on a balcony with a dead microphone stare, visibly unable to process that the adoration he'd manufactured for 24 years had just, in real time, stopped being real. State television cut the broadcast. But it was too late by minutes, not hours. Every Romanian who'd been watching had just seen the single most powerful piece of evidence of the entire revolution. The emperor had no clothes, and the whole country now knew it simultaneously. Mircea Albu, back in Timișoara, watched that broadcast in a neighbor's apartment and later said it was the first moment he actually believed the regime could fall. Not eventually, but soon, possibly within days. He was right. It would fall in 3. By the morning of December 22nd, Bucharest itself was in open revolt. Crowds that had gathered to watch a second scripted rally instead stormed toward Communist Party headquarters. Inside, Ceaușescu could hear the noise growing against the building's own walls. At 12:08 p.m., with protesters reportedly already breaking into the lower floors, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were rushed onto the roof and lifted off by helicopter, along with 2 of their closest aides. What followed was, by any measure, a humiliating collapse for 2 people who had ruled unquestioned for a generation. The helicopter pilot, reportedly fearing the aircraft would be shot down as army units began defecting to the revolution, told the Ceaușescus he needed to land. They switched to a car, then another car, commandeering vehicles as they fled west, increasingly unsure which local officials, if any, were still loyal to them. By early afternoon, they'd been abandoned by their own bodyguards. By that evening, police in the town of Târgoviște, the same town that would host the trial 3 days later, took them into custody and, for their own safety as much as anything, held them at a military base. For 24 years, the entire machinery of the Romanian state existed to serve 2 people. In the space of about 6 hours, that machinery simply stopped, and the 2 people it had served spent the rest of the day being shuffled between commandeered cars, no longer rulers of anything, not yet formally prisoners of anyone. They would spend the next 3 days in military custody, while, back in Bucharest, a new provisional government, the National Salvation Front, hastily assembled from reform-minded officials and army officers, tried to figure out what to do with them. What they decided to do was put them on trial. Fast. There was no time to build a real legal case, and frankly, no interest in one. The National Salvation Front was worried, with real justification, that loyalist Securitate units still fighting in Bucharest might attempt a rescue, or that keeping the Ceaușescus alive gave the old regime something to rally around. So on Christmas Day, a special military tribunal was assembled almost overnight. A chief judge and 2 associate judges, a prosecutor, and 2 court-appointed defense attorneys, the Ceaușescus had never met, and would spend the hearing openly hostile toward. The charges, genocide, tied to the Timișoara shootings and the broader use of force against the population, undermining the national economy, tied to the systematization program and the debt repayment austerity, and abuse of power. From the opening minute, Nicolae refused to recognize the court's authority, insisting he remained the country's legitimate president and would answer only to the Grand National Assembly. He kept that position for the entire 90 minutes, which meant that for most of the trial, he wasn't really defending himself at all. He was simply refusing to participate, occasionally interrupting to correct a fact or challenge a number he considered wrong, as though the trial's legitimacy hinged on getting the statistics right. So Lena, by contrast, engaged constantly, sharp, defensive, frequently cutting off the prosecutor mid-sentence to dispute details, at one point objecting furiously to being addressed without her academic title. The footage, later leaked and broadcast, shows a woman who does not yet understand, cannot yet understand, that the rules that protected her for decades no longer exist in this room. When the prosecutor read the death toll from Timișoara, Nicolae shot back that no such massacre had occurred on his orders, that this was a NATO-orchestrated coup dressed up as a popular uprising. It's a claim historians have found no credible evidence for, but in the moment, it's clear he believed it, or needed to. The court-appointed defense lawyers barely defended anything. One of them, instead of contesting the charges, spent part of his allotted time arguing his clients showed signs of diminished mental capacity, a defense the Ceaușescus themselves angrily rejected, because accepting it meant accepting the court's right to judge them at all. There was no meaningful cross-examination, no defense witnesses, and by several accounts, the judges had already been told what the verdict needed to be before the hearing started. The tribunal deliberated only briefly. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death, to be carried out immediately, with no right of appeal. Nicolae's final documented words, as guards moved to restrain him, were reportedly a request that they not be executed separately. That whatever happened, it happened to them together. What happened next is a matter of public historical record, and this is deliberately where this account stops walking through it moment by moment. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the Târgoviște garrison on the afternoon of December 25, 1989, within minutes of the verdict. It made them the only leaders of a communist government toppled during that year's wave of Eastern Bloc revolutions to be killed as a direct result of their overthrow. Every other 1989 transition, from Poland to Czechoslovakia to East Germany, ended in resignation, exile, or negotiated transfer of power, not execution. Mircea Albu, the young factory worker from Timișoara who'd spent the 17th of December hiding from gunfire in a stairwell, watched footage of the trial on a neighbor's television 4 days later, on December 25th, the same broadcast most of the country saw. He later said it didn't feel like celebration to him, it felt like an ending finally arriving after 10 days that had aged him years. He was 22. He had watched a government that had controlled every part of his life for as long as he could remember, disappear in under 2 weeks. In the days after, investigators and journalists got access to places ordinary Romanians never had, the Ceaușescus' private residences, stocked with imported goods and luxuries unavailable in any state shop, at the exact moment the country outside was rationing bread. The still unfinished House of the People stood as physical proof of where the nation's resources had gone. Securitate archives, when they were eventually opened to the public in the 2000s, confirmed the scale of the informant network that had made ordinary Romanians afraid of their own neighbors for 2 decades. The number of dead across the entire revolution, not just Timișoara, but the fighting in Bucharest and other cities through December 22nd, remains disputed to this day, with credible estimates generally landing over 1,000, far lower than the rumored figures that circulated during the chaos itself, but still making it the bloodiest of the year's Eastern Bloc transitions by a wide margin. Romania spent much of the following 3 decades in legal and political argument over who exactly gave the orders to fire on protesters, and how much of the old Securitate structure simply reformed itself inside the new government, arguments that, in some Romanian courtrooms, are technically still unresolved. For years, rumors persisted about additional unmarked graves connected to the regime's final days, and periodic excavations tied to the revolution's casualties have continued into recent decades, a reminder that for a country that ended its dictatorship in 8 days, actually closing the book on it has taken considerably longer. Nicolae Ceaușescu spent 90 minutes in a schoolroom refusing to admit that the country he'd ruled for 24 years no longer belonged to him. It didn't matter. It already didn't. And somewhere in Timișoara, 3 blocks from where a young factory worker once hid from gunfire in a stairwell, the ground still occasionally gives up what those 8 days cost.